galleries. And I just want to acknowledge that indeed we are sitting here in unceded Coast Salish territory. And I'm going to pass the mic to Amy Kensinger-Chuck, who curated the Dana Claxton show, and will just articulate the context in which this conversation is occurring. So.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming. Just to let you know, housekeeping, if you need to use a washroom, they are indeed on the second floor of this building, and the stairs are over by the entrance that goes into the atrium. And unfortunately, none of the elevators in the building are working right now, so the stairs are all we have. Just wanted to thank, first and foremost, our guests for coming today: Monika Kin Gagnon, Richard William Hill, Tania, Willard, and Kathy Soussloff. Audain and I invited each of them based on their long-term and enduring interest and commitment to her practice. For example, I won't go into a lot of detail, but Monika and Dana have worked together on and off since the 1990s when they worked together at the Pitt Gallery and Arts Peak. Monika also conducted a conversation with Dana in 13 Conversations About Art and Cultural Race Politics, which she co-edited with Richard Fung in 2002, and wrote about Dana's practice in Other Conundrums, Race, Culture, and Canadian Art. Tania and Dana have written and curated together on numerous projects, including Indian Acts, Aboriginal performance art, at the Grant Gallery in, what year is that? Ish? Recently, sorry. About 6 years ago, Dana says. Tania also curated Starting From Home, an online retrospective of Dana's practice. And Richard William Hill most recently wrote 2 critical articles on Dana's work, one being Signs of Success in the most recent issue of Prefix Photo, and the return of a column that he used to do in Fuse magazine and is now being republished in C magazine called Close Reading, which he did on the Plains Indians Artists from Earth and Sky exhibition that Dana participated at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. That's also in the most recent issue of C magazine. Just a few more thank yous. This exhibition could also not have been possible without the commitment of SFU Gallery's team, which includes Cassidy Richardson, Mandy Ginson, Christina Headland, and Dylan McHugh, and especially not without the support, the critical guidance, and encouragement of Melanie O'Brien. I'd also like to acknowledge Lindsay Lachance's contribution to the exhibition by hosting the first intertextual reading series, and Wei Yi, whose name last name I don't know, but Chang, for working with us to organize the series. And we're also very grateful to Michelle and Paisley Nahaney from the Capilano Tea Company, who have provided tea and bannock service for us today. And I am particularly grateful to Dana Claxton's insight and vision. She put forward the first questions that imbued these works with a sense of urgency and propelled this exhibition to take shape at this time in this gallery. And some of those original questions included: what terms can contemporary art set for being with Indigenous belongings, knowledges, and relations? How can contemporary artistic practices be acts of doing, becoming, and world-making that suspend a positive tension between the past and future, but emphasize the liveness of the present? And what gazes does one look with? What veils does one look through? And what does one see and not see? God, my hand is really shaking like crazy here. Since Made to Be Ready opened 6 weeks ago, Dana's works have provoked numerous questions in private conversations, the reading group, school and public tours. We have had the opportunity to scratch the surface of some of them, but I wanted to put forward some of the additional ones so maybe they can be folded into the conversation today. They include, but are not limited to, of course, what are the formal, photographic, performative, and cinematographic strategies that Dana takes up in her works in this exhibition, and why? How are Dana's strategies in dialogue with other Vancouver photographic practices, contemporary and historical? How do we talk about beauty at this moment? Both our exhaustion with beauty and with gazing at women's bodies, as well as our simultaneous desire for this gaze to be inspired by beauty and not objection. And what is the space that these photographs are taken in? Where do these performances reside geographically and temporarily? temporaneously. Sorry, I've written the wrong word here. So I'm going to leave those up in the air for both the audience and the panelists to consider or not in their talk. And I will just introduce Catherine Soussloff, who is going to moderate the conversation for us today. I didn't actually get to say a little bit about Dana's connection to Kathy, but they're both colleagues together at UBC and the Department of Art History, Visual Art, and Theory. And a lot of their discussions about their mutual practice have grown through their time working there together, which is part of why we wanted to have her with us. So like I said, she's a professor in the Department of Art History, Visual Art, and Theory, and an associate of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of British Columbia. She is known for her comparative and historical approaches to the central theoretical concerns of European and North American art and aesthetics, including photography and film from the Renaissance to present. That's a little bit of an introduction to Kathy's background. So I will hand it off from there. I'm going to say one thing. They're going to each give, Kathy will explain this, they're each going to give some opening remarks, and then we're really going to try to make the majority of the event an open conversation, and I will ask you that you do wait until the microphone comes around to you if you have a question, and that you do speak into it, both so people can hear and so it can be recorded. So thank you in advance for your patience on that.
Thank you, Amy. And hello and welcome to everyone. I'm pleased to extend a warm greeting to the speakers on the panel. And to remind us all that the panel is about Dana Claxton and her work in this exhibition, Made to be Ready, here at the Audain Gallery, which was curated by Amy Kazmierczak. And I want to thank Amy and Melanie O'Brien and Dana for inviting all of us to participate and to speak with you today about Dana's work. Dana Claxton is a Lakota filmmaker, photographer, and performance artist. She teaches at UBC in the Department of Art History, Visual Art, and Theory. In the solo exhibition at the Audain Gallery, the works on view embody and refer to multiple visual modes in her work. Today, I'm honored to be part of a conversation about her work together with Monika Gagnon, Richard Hill, and Tania Willard. Now, each of our speakers today has already made a number of important contributions to our understanding of Dana Claxton's work in the specific context of Canadian First Nations art and in the situation of the larger art world of the past decades. I'm pleased to introduce the speakers to you briefly now, and each speaker will have about 15 minutes to address the exhibition, the works, and other works by Dana, and to raise some questions and to be provoked by the works in terms of these questions. I've asked the speakers to keep to the 15 minutes so we can have time for discussion afterwards, 15 minutes each. And following the presentations, I'll make a few remarks and then launch a question for conversation to begin amongst the speakers and then to open it out to you. So I'll begin, and I'm going to just go in order and introduce everyone at the beginning, and then I'll let you all know when your 15 minutes is almost up. How's that? Monika Gagnon is professor, to my immediate right, is professor of communication studies at Concordia University. She has published widely on cultural politics, the visual and media arts since the 1980s, including Other Conundrums, Race, Culture, and Canadian Art, and 13 conversations about art and cultural race politics with Richard Fung. She recently published Communicating the Intermedia Archive on Theresa Hak Kyung Cha's unfinished film, White Dust from Mongolia, and she co-edited Reimagining Cinema, film at Expo 67. Monika will speak about contemporary media strategies and performance in the context of Dana's exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum last year, among other things. Richard Hill is a curator, critic, and art historian. He is the new Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Studies at Emily Carr University of Art and Design, and we welcome you to Vancouver. His research focuses on historical and contemporary art created by Indigenous North American artists. Hill taught full-time in the art history program at York University from 2007 to 2015, and as a curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario, he oversaw the museum's first substantial effort to include Indigenous North American art and ideas in their permanent collection. Hill's essays on art have appeared internationally in numerous formats. Richard Hill will speak about the associations that Claxton's work provokes while remaining inconclusive and indefinite. I don't know whether he will remain that way or she will. Tania Willard. Shapok Nation works with the shifting ideas of contemporary and traditional art as they relate to the cultural arts and production. Willard's curatorial work includes Beat Nation, art, hip hop, and Aboriginal culture, a national touring exhibition, first presented here in Vancouver in 2011 at the BAG. Her upcoming project, co-curated with Karen Dufek, will be a solo exhibition, Unceded Territories, Lawrence Paul at the Museum of Anthropology in 2016, which we will greet with great anticipation. Willard's personal curatorial projects include Bush Gallery, a conceptual space for land-based art and action, led by Indigenous artists. Tania Willard will speak today about Claxton's video work in relationship to Indigenous women and the principles of living in beauty.
Also inconclusive.
Also inconclusive. Okay, so I will turn it now over to you, Monika. Thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you very much. I want to just start by thanking Dana and Amy for inviting me all the way from Montreal to Vancouver. I lived here for about 8 years in the 1990s. And as Amy mentioned, I first met Dana actually on West Hastings, a little bit further up. And so it was amazing to be walking down the street to come down to the gallery and the exhibition. And I was kind of captured in what cultural geographer Doreen Massey has called the envelope of space-time. The most startling part being that I think the Pit and Art Speak Gallery have burnt down. I think that building is now gone entirely, so it's a public parking lot. But at the time in the early 90s, I met Dana because I was at Art Speak on the second floor. I can't remember the exact address. And Dana was the director of the Pit Gallery downstairs. And I have some vivid memories of meeting Dana at the time, of us running up and down the stairs, in some cases borrowing hammers or other types of tools. But maybe more importantly, thinking back to the amazing hub and community that she had created at the Pit Gallery for Indigenous artists, and particularly performance artists in the 1990s at the time that she was there as a director. I was startled in preparing for this talk to not find a bit more of a historical trace, and that certainly of some of the exhibitions that she did and many of the events that she had done at the Pit Gallery at the time. And it's certainly a wonderful history that could be written of her time there. The other vivid memory that I do have also is after work one day and closing Art Speak, going downstairs, and Dana was shooting the red paper in the Pit Gallery space. And I remember peeking in the windows, and the windows were covered, but there was I could peek in a little bit, and there was a dolly track and an entire film crew. And it was it was the scene of the actor who was wearing, who played the kind of cardinal figure, the religious cardinal figure. Who was the Chris Redcrow was all decked out, and it was lit very brightly. And she was basically shooting after hours at the Pit Gallery in that space. I guess I followed strict rules by Amy and Dana that I wasn't supposed to write a paper, and so I have 12 pages of little notes that have bubbles and arrows and numbers, which I'm going to follow. But I actually found Amy's questions incredibly compelling, so I do want to try and come back to some of them, in particular, the idea of the strategies, the cinematic and photographic strategies that are in the work here. I was, of course, preparing for the talk, looking at small reproductions on my screen and also watching the Vimeo it's beautiful to come into this space, and I immediately felt relaxed when I came in to take a look at it. I think going back to the red paper and the shooting of the red paper, because that's when I first met Dana, I was always both, initially when I saw it, puzzled and mesmerized by the film, and was able, a few years later, to curate it into a show that was co-curated with Grant Arnold and Doreen Jensen in 1996, called Topographies, where the red paper was an installation with the kind of gilded gold seating with the red velvet covers. And I think what was so puzzling and mesmerizing was the complete shift in perspective to Eurocentric colonial discourses that the film itself undertakes, as well as a kind of appropriation of European aesthetic styles and also language and modes of address. But when I had written and thought about the film itself, I always talked about it as being, in shorthand, the view from the beach. So in other words, dominant colonial discourse always has us arriving on shores, whereas Dana was basically flipping the perspective completely to be the perspective from the beach, which to me was really a disruption of the usual types of points of view that are undertaken. I want to introduce a concept that comes from literature originally from Gérard Genette in 1980, but got used in 1994 by Ella Chohat and Robert Stamm in their book, Unthinking Eurocentrism, which is the term focalization. And focalization, in the way that they use it for film and video, is really to talk about the point of view or the perspective that's undertaken in a film or a video work, and how focalization is the point of view that the narrative kind of pulls you through. And as they talk about it, and as Jeanette also talks about it as well, it doesn't, that focalization doesn't have to be singular in one work. It can shift around and have multiple perspectives on it. And I think that this term is really useful for thinking about Dana's work, because I think what is puzzling and mesmerizing and draws one into the work is the kind of complex narrative structures that don't allow you to settle as a viewer completely. You're constantly kind of moving across different layers. The other thing that Chohat and Stamm say when they use the term focalization is that it can also be a site of contradiction. So in other words, it doesn't have to be a kind of fixed perspective or point of view or positionality either. It doesn't have to be a subjective, coherent narrativization that's taking place. And I think it's that unsettled quality as well that is what draws us into the work. And I would say very much so with the elements that are here with us today. I think the importance of this focalization that comes through the work, through Dana's work, and I think we could go through a number of different film and video works, as well as her photographs, and I'd say the performances as well, where we can see this positionality, this strong positionality that she brings as a Lakota Indigenous woman's subjective perspective that we're not used to seeing dominantly within popular culture, within our artistic discourse, or within historical narratives either. And I would say in this way, what she does through her work, through her artistic practice, her cultural practice, as well as her community and political work, has been to create an alternative set of histories that challenge the dominant in multiple types of ways. So what I want to do is kind of think about this idea of focalization in relationship to these works. And there's been a fair amount of press that has happened around this exhibition here locally in Vancouver. It's the beauty of art blogging culture now, is that you can get kind of strong critics and writers publishing immediately while an exhibition is still up, instead of having that kind of lag time of hard copy publishing. And so one article in particular that really captivated my interest was a conversation that Dana had with Leah Sandals in the Canadian Art website, where she essentially outlined 6 ways to resist art's dehumanization of Indigenous peoples. And I'm just going to outline them really quickly. You can go to the site yourself. But I think what it does is it really positions her strategy in relationship to this work quite concisely, and also gives us a sense of how she's focalizing herself and the narratives that she's kind of bringing into play here. So I'll just read these quickly. So number 1, redefine how we think and speak of Indigenous cultural belongings, particularly in anthropological, museological, and art circles. One thing I would say that's really interesting here, she doesn't talk about cultural belonging. She talks about cultural belongings. In other words, it shifts into the space of objects, artifacts, and discourses, and the layering of discourses, as opposed to it being this notion of cultural belonging, which brings in a subjective dimension and questions of identity more clearly. So I think this shifting to the kind of structural dimensions of dehumanization and racism, within which anthropological, ethnological, and art historical discourses, and contemporary art as well, participate, is a kind of crucial point to think about in relationship to this work. Number 2, reconsider the original context in which Indigenous cultural belongings were made and used. Again, I think the shift here that she is insisting upon is the move away from objects to reinscribing the materiality and performativity of Indigenous culture. And I think here, if we'll, in the question period or in the discussion period, we'll look to these works more particularly, we'll see the kind of aliveness that this reinscription to the contexts in which these objects circulate. Number 3, recognize that art has played into the structural dehumanization of Indigenous people. And here she cites a few examples. She says incorrect tribal affiliations would be one way that this structural dehumanization takes place. She also mentions the ways in which Indigenous culture is often characterized as primitive culture. And finally, she names the historical outline of cultural forms using the examples of the potlatch and the Sundance. Number 4, remember how complex rehumanization is, as complex as the history that has dehumanized people themselves. And here, I think, is the kind of one that I want to dwell on a bit and try and kind of flesh out just briefly in relationship to this work. And it's really about the kind of, what she expands upon is the multiple gazes that occur on the Indigenous body. And I think in this particular exhibition, and I think through her body of work as well, more specifically the Indigenous women's body, and insists that these multiple gazes and the burden of history through multiple types of discourses continues to haunt all social relations today. Number 5, she says, recall that beauty, even though it is fraught, can still be a useful tool. And I'm just guessing that this point about beauty, particularly in relationship to this work, has raised a lot of questions and debate. And I hope that I'll have a couple of minutes just to speak to that a little bit, because I think that Dana's interest in fashion and making her own costumes and clothing imbues all of her work, I would say, right from the red paper. All the costumes that were in the red paper, were made herself so lovingly. For those of you that have seen Tree of Consumption, I think it was her sister Kim who made this spectacular dress where she was elevated on a platform, and this dress, a platform that was a tree, and the dress kind of spread out all over. And also, I would say in Fringed, which was her performance that she did at the Metropolitan Museum almost exactly a year ago today, again, it was this kind of combination of simplicity of the materiality of the costume that she was wearing herself, as well as a similar type of headdress to the one that we see here that covered her face, and her moving through the space and playing with these fringes that were making sounds as they were being beaten down on the ground is also an aspect that is very much part of her performance work. Finally, the sixth point that she makes is rework the stereotypes as needed. And I think she mentions in particular this work here, where she says that her experience with the stereotypical forms of kitsch that circulate within popular culture, small little Indian dolls in souvenir shops is an example that she gives, is what she refers to when she's looking at this work in particular. And so I haven't had a chance to talk with Dana about the elements in the show themselves, but it's this kind of crystalline buffalo head that Samari, the model, is carrying, wearing this kind of spectacular sequined dress that looks like it's out of Disney, that is both playing with the conventions of Sundance culture, but at the same time running parallel to popular culture and the kinds of images that circulate as well. So I'd say if, 2 minutes? Okay. So I guess maybe the closing point that I would make, since I probably should move to a closing point here, is that to me, this exhibition in some ways inscribes Indigenous culture into everyday practices. And the way that it does that is by taking elements that are part of the living culture that has been for decades, centuries, outlawed and repressed, and attempts to kind of enliven and reinscribes these objects back into the everyday. I'm not going to dare talk about the Plains Indians Earth and Sky exhibition, since I haven't read the article that Richard wrote. But I have to say, I was in New York to go and see the exhibition, saw the performance as well, and there was such an enormous sadness, but also incredibly astonishing beauty in the objects themselves. And it really was about the kind of discursive frame of the ethnographic museum coming to bear through the collections of these French travelers and traders that had confined these objects that were clearly to be used in live cultural practices, whether they were social or ritual or ceremonial, and they were like captured on the wall, unable to move. Ceremonial war robes, war shields. And then in the kind of last little room was the contemporary work, which was kind of squashed with very little space around it, but that had such a contestational quality to it. And the installation that Dana had in that exhibition was Rattle, which is a 4-screen video installation, which alternates beadwork and an image of a rattle being shaken. And so the whole time that you're sitting there, you're hearing the rattle sounds as well. And so I think what it is to kind of bring these kind of artifacts that have been deadened in the context of ethnological, anthropological, and in some ways art historical discourse as well, into the present as kind of active objects that are performed and made into use. And it's wonderful to be able to see this exhibition. It's a beautiful installation. I just want to say that, just in closing, that I think what the coloration of the walls and the space that's allowed around the images really brings a kind of theatrical dimension, which is very much a part of Dana's work, which we see the most in her performance work. But I think that it brings that kind of animated sense into the space in an extraordinary way. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Monika. Richard Hill.
Go for it?
Please go for it.
Okay. I want to start also, of course, by thanking Amy and Dana. I think this is the first time I've had a chance to do a public talk in Vancouver since I've moved here outside of Emily Carr. And it's really great to have the opportunity to do it with such esteemed colleagues and to be able to speak about the work of such an important artist. So thank you very much for this chance. I should also say, if you haven't noticed already, that I'm a little under the weather. I don't know if viruses are getting stronger or if I'm getting weaker, but I can't seem to shake this one off. So bear with me a little bit. I've written something rather than speaking extemporaneously, which I had originally planned to do, just because I'm afraid otherwise I won't get through it coherently. So it's not a paper, it's just a little talk. I was tempted to wear my pajamas and sip some lemon tea or something, and now that I see the environment, I realize it would have only been too convincing, so good thing I didn't. So when I was first asked to be on this panel, it was, way back a long time ago before the show had actually happened. And I always worry when I'm asked to write or speak about art that I haven't seen yet, because I'm one of those people, basically, that if I'm not visited by a muse of some sort, then I tend to just say only the obvious things. And on a panel, of course, there's the added danger that we'll say the same things as each other, obvious or not. And there's going to be some overlap, I can tell already, but I think from very different points of view, so I think it will actually maybe be interesting to hear the perspectives on things in different ways. Anyway, so I wanted to try to view this exhibition slightly from a side angle, so to speak. I've also chosen not to speak to Dana about the work, and I haven't read any of the online things as well. Deliberately, I've avoided them. I think it's often actually helpful to know what an artist's intentions are, obviously. But this time I wanted to just allow myself the liberty to cast my thoughts across all of the potential meanings of the work without having that limit in the beginning. And so in that sense, I hope to be speculative rather than definitive, if we're coming back to that. No one wants to be pinned down anymore, I guess. It's safer. First, though, I'd like to say something obvious, the most obvious thing, and I want to say it for political reasons, especially given that I'm a man on this panel, and that is that this is an exhibition about the Indigenous female body and how it's inscribed and also constrained by culture and colonial politics. It's a body in trouble, and I think also a body in triumph. Triumph isn't quite the right word, but language never does provide the right word, only the least inadequate, so I'll go with triumph for now. It's a body bound and a body spiritually transcendent, and perhaps a body somewhere in between two. Most importantly, it's a body that is a subject of public discourse, a body that matters. It's important to say that because by saying it in public, we help to make what we know to be true in our hearts publicly true as well. I think that's extremely important. I was going to say, some of you may know that I recently wrote a review of the exhibition, The Plains Indian Artists, Artists of the Earth and Sky, that was at the Metropolitan Museum in New York last spring. Well, now you all know that. The exhibition faced a number of structural curatorial problems that the Met addressed with varying degrees of success, and which Monika outlined to a certain extent. One obvious problem was how to compensate for missing context. The historical objects on display had arisen out of and from the materials of a particular landscape and were often made to be seen in that landscape. The exhibit designers compensated for this by creating floor-to-ceiling photo murals of the plains landscape. Also, for the most part, these objects had been made to be worn or carried on the body and to be used in relation to each other and other arts, often in the context of ceremony, again, as echoing what you said. And I just want to read a short bit from my review, just because it gives a clear sense of my perspective on it. Surprisingly, the most effectively integrated contemporary work in the show is a video installation set off on its own, Claxton's Rattle. And I was surprised because so much of the other contemporary work was badly handled, as you said, and so it's kind of stunning that the video installation was the one thing they seemed to get right. The narrow little room that it is in shows 2 video projections side by side on the longer wall. Visitors can sit on a bench against the wall opposite to watch them. The video is a poetic evocation of the experience of traditional song and dance, focused on the image of a rattle in use. Sweeping movements of the body, sound washes, mysterious details of costume and gestures all move by at a pace and level of abstraction that invites reflection. If the photo murals on the walls of the other gallery provide the missing landscape that the museum can only mimetically point to, then Claxton's video symbolically returns the painfully absent body that the historical works were made to adorn and give meaning to. This not only indexes the contemporary persistence of an adorned plains body, but demonstrates the object's immersion in social practices and regular interaction with other arts, such as song and dance, that the historical objects in the cases are cut off from. I sat for a long time before the video, thinking about what I was seeing and hearing, and about the exhibition in general. I concluded that it might be good for more exhibitions to end with the contemplation of an evocative artwork in a darkened space where one could sit and reflect before re-entering regular life, especially if regular life is the crass yammering for attention of a gallery gift shop, which is the case at the Met. Still, not everyone was impressed. A visitor seated beside me for a few minutes complained to his wife, "Nothing's happening. This is stupid. Why get you to sit down and watch when nothing happens?" Some people have a funny idea of what constitutes nothing. And that's the end of the quote. Nothing. I want to think of the question of landscape in this exhibition. That seems quite odd here. At first glance, the work seems to exist in several very specific types of artistic non-space. The non-space of the modern white cube gallery, or in this case, disrupted as it is into a gray cube, or the blank backdrop of the portrait photo shoot. These non-spaces are supplemented by another sort of non-space, the non-space of the theater stage. That space can be stripped down to an empty stage and the control of its lighting. This is occurring in the video here and also in the wall color and theatrical lighting of the space. It's precisely this bracketing off from the background context that produces the context of art. And this is art's double-edged sword. We agree to believe in this non-space. It isn't really, as Brian O'Doherty demonstrated compellingly many years ago, as I'm sure most of you know, but we accept the conceit and use it as a lens to pull some object or other into artistic focus. As it sharpens, its background blurs out, it potentially loses its connection to our life world. So I'm really interested in the tension in this work between objects and their context, especially given the tradition I mentioned of their integration into life, and the artist's decision to focus on them theatrically here. I think it's a very powerful gesture to play with that tension and to play with questions about how art works and how galleries work. I think it follows up in a way on what you're saying. I'd also like to suggest that there actually is a landscape present in this space, after all. It's created by the raking light in that video, which establishes a horizontal line across the stage, a ground line, a horizon line, a horizontal axis. You don't need to have a knowledge of Plains Indigenous aesthetics to make the connection, but I think it actually really helps. The historical artists of the Plains, of vast skies and distant, often flat horizons, frequently represented the horizontal line of the earth and speculated about what it meant to be a connection point between earth and sky. When we look at this work, we can see that when a woman stands, it can be a moment of spiritual transcendence, but not one in which the earth is forgotten. We can also see that in this video as well, as a woman finally takes her place in this minimal landscape and raises her body up along a vertical axis, she's done more than get to her feet. She has stood up. I still worry about her, though. The video's on a loop. One woman has stood up. One woman has stood up. There are many more that must follow. In thinking of this journey from abjection to triumph, it seems that there's something more ambiguous mediating these two states. As Monika said, literally the stuff, the materiality of Indigenous cultural objects. I don't want to come to any conclusions about that yet in my talk. I'm going to take seriously the invitation to leave space for discussion, but I hope that I have helped to give some place for that discussion where at first glance there might not have seemed to have been one. Thank you.
Tania, Willard?
All right, wow. Well, first of all, thank you all for your discussion so far, and thanks to Dana and Amy for inviting me, / also you invited me, and it's very intimidating to speak after Monika and Richard. So, but I have, and I'm not going to say anything conclusive, and I don't have anything written. I'm simply sort of responding to the work with a knowledge of some of Dana's practice, which I've been privileged to sort of have a window to. I knew of Dana's practice for some time. Again, this neighborhood has a centrality to kind of my exploration of moving into art discourse and art world things. I used to work with an Aboriginal publication just up the road, and I sort of moved from that space into Grunt Gallery, which is where I came to know Dana's work a little bit more, and was paired with her for this project to curate her work, a retrospective of her work, which was always problematic in an online space, but since it's become static. But a retrospective of her work. I was really intimidated to meet Dana in the first place. I think, you know, I walked all the way to her house one day and came in with a big coat and was really intimidated to even start a discussion with her, being that she's a much more established artist, and I was just sort of starting out to explore these kinds of things. But Dana was so generous in welcoming me into understanding the work, and I think that when I see this work, I feel that generosity again. When I come into the space, you know, frazzled from taking the wrong turn off the ferry and trying to make it here, I still can get here and sort of breathe and relax a bit. And it's this space we've been talking about that becomes sort of filled with generosity, filled with provocation, I think, as well in this work, and filled with beauty. And I know we talked about some of how we talk about beauty and what, you know, how many pitfalls there is in something as sort of broad and survey as beauty. But I know that Dana has at times talked about walking in beauty and living in beauty, and approaches this idea of it as a holistic and sort of philosophical way. And it's not just about what we see in front of us, although we see these incredibly evocative, crisp, theatrical kinds of images. But they're also really relatable. And I think about intuition when I look at the work. I'm sort of looking at each work and thinking about what each one brings to me. And when you cover the face, and we talked about other works where she's doing some covering, you're relying on something internal as the compass, both for navigating and negotiating maybe cultural and artistic kinds of institutions, and also perhaps speaking to just the creative sort of process as well. And so I think about how it's both a hindrance. You know, originally we think of just cutting off this sense, but then it helps us to arrive at a kind of intuitive navigation. And so also it denies us. We have this really evocative surface of the beads, the collected material here, which obviously have all kinds of cultural relations as well. But it's not giving us the face, right? So we're not consuming this face of beauty. This is a language of fashion advertisement in a sense, because it's the really perfect image. Yet we have all these obstacles to want for us the way we normally would consume an image of beauty. And I think that speaks to that deeper exploration in Dana's work. And I think when I was able to make the opening. I was really thankful to be here and see the work just briefly in the context of the opening, but really sort of perceived, and this might seem quite simplistic to say, but this sort of journey through the work. And it is cyclical. It does loop. We're in this space with a directionality. I think artist and curator have thought about positioning each one of these works. I appreciated at the opening when Dana discussed being thankful for this opportunity and for this space, but also thinking about how honoring and thanking and generosity was part of not just her work in constructing the image and creating the work, but she talked about the sort of what has, not just the object of the work, but all the labor, all the materials, all the resources that actually are in the material of the artwork itself. And she speaks about some of these in terms of being air or fireboxes. And so it's true that there's a space where we don't see a representation of the landscape, but I get the same sense of this horizon indicating the land. And I get the sense of the materiality of aluminum being mined, and these kinds of, that we think really deeply through the kinds of resources that are evident both in the cultural kinds of material in the work, but also in the final object of the work as well. I thought a little bit in this work, I know in talking with Dana for her retrospective, we talked a little bit about surrealist film and its influence early on for Dana. And we also talked about the sky. And I thought about this, this scene, which is probably like too well known to even discuss for a famous surrealist film, with the dragging of material. And I was thinking of this film and how just this work is so much the polar opposite of what is a very sort of disturbing amass of material in the scene of Un Chien Andalou, where there's a kind of cultural indications in that material as well that's being really struggled and pulled in this giant kind of mass behind a subject. And I think of this work as so much the opposite of that, although I conjure that kind of scene. In here, there's so many more indications of wayfinding, but it's also, again, it's not only that. We also have a lot of obstacle and negotiation, and I think about that constant tension as an Indigenous woman in the contemporary urban space. And I think about this constant push and pull. And I look at the material that's in this work, and I think about carrying things that protect us, and carrying things that defend us, and carrying things that we remember ourselves and our families in. And I think about all these sort of objects and how they're imbuing this power, but also this consideration and this navigation system. And maybe that's, again, where I read the landscape into what is otherwise, perhaps, when you first see it, an empty space. I know Dana talked a little bit in this work about different jewelry objects that she had and that become a focus in this work. And I think about that in terms of navigating as well, in terms of things we may have as gifts, which give us a different kind of satisfaction, not only when we wear it, and they speak to a kind of an exchange. And so I think also I read in these images this present and ongoing exchange. And then I think, as well, I think about the space of slowness in the video, and this very careful view, I think, in Dana's work, where we don't have to rush through it, and that's that generosity, again, I think, and that focus, where Dana has so carefully considered this work and her presence, and we're just really gifted to be in this space and to exist with it for a period of time. And that slowness is just so generative for us to allow space to consider the artist's work, but to consider our place in it as well. And then if I were to, move in a sort of arrangement and thinking about the work, we come to this work of sort of exaltation, this work here, which is sort of all about kind of unabashed beauty and maybe triumph. Or I was thinking a word that really comes across for me in looking at all the work is also dignity. That the way that Dana is treating this material, even in the depths of what might be sadness or struggle or difficulty or conflict, that in every part it's dignified and it's beautiful. And that's where I see the sort of more radical potential of talking about beauty as something separate from just what we might sort of consume aesthetically or figuratively in the image. And I think that here it becomes a kind of a wayfinding again, and a kind of a generous space to navigate. And those tools are just ultimately so important. And that's why I consider the sort of times that early on that I met Dana and sort of got a better understanding of her practice and her contributions to the community largely, not only through her creative work and practice, but through her work professionally as a filmmaker, as a media artist, and the contributions where she's written and curated extensively. And she has, I think, a practice where she showed a lot outside of Vancouver as well. And to see her work grounded here with such careful eyes and curating and considering the work is really refreshing. And I certainly think about her retrospective and think about my knowledge of some of those works and how amazing a space it is to see that all together. Again, those early works at the Pit, Tree of Consumption, those early works that have such a beautiful integration in this. And I get really excited about the future to see the work on a wider scale. And I'm just really thankful to have some time to think through those pieces that are here and through that body of work, and to just be a little bit close to understanding that tool of wayfinding through what Dana has presented. So I have no idea what time.
You have more time.
I can
do what you'd like.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to slow down for a minute then.
Okay.
And think about what else I wanted to say. I do also have some little notes that I wrote down that are not really that helpful, but yeah, I guess one of the things I was thinking about, even though I know nothing about surrealist film, and I would say it's quite bold of me to just talk about feminism and surrealism, but I see that sort of operating. And Dana and I, when we worked back and forth a little bit, talking about the Indianax conference, which was hosted by Audain Gallery, happened many years ago, and was a gathering of really amazing Indigenous performance artists. And we talked about the sort of Indigenous roots of Cabaret Voltaire and of surrealism and performance, and somewhat surreptitiously, in that we didn't have citations and all this body of thing, but we really worked through writing that together as an intuitive process as well. And I like to think of her work as sort of really exerting an Indigenous woman's perspective, that strength and dignity over a kind of overly sort of modernist, macho kind of thing that's happening in sort of maybe the formation of surrealism. And again, it's that power in doing that. And something like The Red Paper, which I saw at an installation at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Again, I think we can read into the idea of the disrupted narrative and how Dana is constructing that film. It's the spaces in between, those empty spaces, that we then start to fill ourselves, that we start to read into the subtleties of what Dana is presenting, so that we don't see the same kind of standard theater, the same kind of standard narrative. She's completely inverted it. And it's in that reflection that we start to be able to read it. And again, that's about not a standard view. And so often we have to cut ourselves off from what we rely on as our senses, the navigation we rely on in terms of the ways to see a kind of dominant, to participate in a dominant part of British Columbia or of Canada. And it's in being able to take that away that we can start to see other paths and other avenues. And they're not definitive, and I think that's that body of generosity. But they are filled with dignity and potential.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm going to say a few words and then maybe provoke some questions based on what's been said, and beginning with Amy's remarks and questions. But I have written something down because I haven't ever sat down to think through Dana's work before. I've thought about it a lot and talked with her about it, but I haven't sat down before to think through it. And when I want to think through something, I have to write. So I wrote something, but I have a lot of scribbles all over it too. So I also think that I wanted to write something because I feel a risk in speaking as a non-Indigenous person on this panel, but I also feel an affinity with Dana as an outsider. And I'm not going to go into that, but into my identity as an outsider, other than to say that I'm new to Vancouver, still feeling new after 6 years. So I feel outside in that position sometimes, but not as much as I used to, which is the good news. I think of Dana Claxton as an art warrior for her people, astonishing ambition, a manner of being on the inside while operating on the outside. Part of the outside is contemporary art theory and post-colonial discourse. I think of her videos, photographs, and performances as made to be ready to teach the meanings of ways of knowing the world that she has learned from her culture and from her experience outside. That is, as a feminist Lakota woman in a post-colonial Canada. In her work, the spiritual life and lives of her people are alluded to, but deferred in the name of art. Like a Sundancer's rattle, and I just think this rattle piece, and the rattle is a very significant part of Dana's work. Like a Sundancer's rattle, a slow and constant rustle of the memories of social and ritual actions can be found in the work, but this remains in the background. Her approach is not to remake, reenact, or reactivate. She escapes the methods of exact resemblance and the traps of historicity, using an ironic mode of address, a not uncomfortable position for the postmodern viewer like me or you, even one which we might well be seduced by, which might well seduce us. Is Claxton translating? Well, yes, to a certain degree, given the copious meanings of the term translation found in the discourse on culture today. But she is also reworking the ironic use of stereotypes. For example, the Chippewa writer and theorist Gerald Vizenor, who Dana speaks of very highly and whose work she considers important to her own thinking and her own working, the Chippewa writer and theorist Gerald Vizenor might understand the banality of the anthropological artifacts trailing behind the dancing figure in this piece called Cultural Belonging. He might understand them as a sign of the artifactualization of culture, as he called it. However, the beauty and apparent authenticity of these instruments of the dance, associated as they are in the photograph with the action of the dancer, also makes us understand that their display cannot be simply either a totalizing gesture of critique or an act of appropriation. Claxton's ironic address allows us to inhabit our already broken into parts culture. She comes to it, like we all do, to a culture that's already broken into parts. Thus, her work offers a sideways approach into a political critique of that culture. The anti-anthropological, anti-ethnographical approach to our present political reality may first appear at odds with the essential mimetic forms and media used by Claxton in the videos and photographs. Yet with her work, we cannot go to that place that the representational arts prefer, the willing suspension of disbelief in the fictions they present. That's what mimetic representation wants us to do. But instead, the attentive viewer of Claxton's work feels the burden of a long trail of glittering trinkets that stretches back into historical time. The problems inherent to our views of exoticized women and static gender roles. The tug between Claxton's artifactualizations and her terminal creeds, another term used by Visenor, terminal creeds, is meant to open up a space to recode and rethink prior views and continuing prejudices. The Audain Gallery is a place intended for encounters and open to dialogue about the compelling issues raised by art making today. Let me launch our discussion with a question for the speakers on the panel. I've already given them a preview of it. And I will use a term borrowed again from Gerald Visenor. Admittedly, he is a critic of texts, not visual representations and not artworks, or at least not visual forms. But I think he has something to say to us when he uses the word strategies of indirection, such as we find here in Claxton's work, irony, masking, performance, techniques, and uses. So doubling, mirroring, like in the Buffalo piece. My question is, how do the strategies of indirection found in Claxton's work help you, speakers, aid you in understanding something about the possibility for change in social relations today and here? So I'll open it up to you guys now. I don't have to say any more.
I should have brushed up on my Gerald Visenor before.
That's all right.
Today.
It doesn't have to be an approach to Gerald Visenor.
Yeah. I'm actually going to defer, though, maybe to Richard and Tania first to see if they have anything to say about indirectionality.
Oh, damn. I guess I should have brushed up, too. Because when you asked, she gave us, as she said, this question in advance, so I have been thinking about it. And it was only as you presented what you just presented that I realized I was probably conflating indeterminacy and indirection in a way, because in terms of how I'd been thinking about answering that. So I feel sorry to be stupidly at a loss.
That's okay.
Even though given the full warning. But I guess one of the things that, in a way, the talk that I gave just now, the little talk, was a way to kind of approach the work indirectly while acknowledging what was direct, because there are things that are directly and explicitly important in this work, for sure, I think, and there are positions that the artist has taken that aren't ambiguous at all. So, I think that's always important to remember as we then try to get into the things that are more indirect or in a way at least more ambiguous. And I guess for me, in terms of grappling with the work, it is about trying to figure out the way in which the work is kind of short-circuiting kind of easy reading of it, I guess, in that sense. And that's the thing that, some of these works seem on the surface to be very they just put something out there and they're hitting you with it in a very strong way. But then when you start to think about them, there are all sorts of questions that you have, and they're not reconciled in the work. And people laughed when I said that this woman is on a loop, but she's really on a loop. Yeah. And it's a pretty quick turnaround between the moment when she stands up and then, there's not like a black screen for a long time, at least unless it's changed since I watched it at the opening. So you have to take that loopness seriously about it. And so then you ask, well, has she risen up and transcended, or is she kind of just back crawling again? And I offered one solution to that, how we might think about that, which is that that's not just one woman, that's potentially many different women who are in situations like that. And so the fact that there's a woman constantly crawling across that screen gives us hope for her to stand up, and also reminds us that there are lots of people still in that situation of what's only can be described as abjection. And you don't have to walk far from this gallery to find people in that situation. So to me, it's that aspect that really gets my attention. And in a way, I feel almost like it's really interesting to be sitting here in the middle, poised between these two works, where you see kind of abjection and triumph. As I said, again, triumph, not the right word, but I'll just let it do for now. And then things seem so much more complicated here. And in a way, I feel like this is the kind of it's a messy space that's a kind of live space in a way, that is a mediator between these two poles somehow in my mind. And I think I struggle over these works. Like, I think we all kind of have, with a face that's covered, and what's the kind of, as someone who has a face that would probably be improved by being covered with beads, I can't complain, but it makes me anxious to see someone's face covered at the same time as I understand exactly what the argument that you made about kind of withholding the gaze. And there's a really great discourse about how Indigenous artists have resisted gazes in all kinds of ways. And I feel the same way about this kind of where's my fashion vocabulary when I need it? This train, kind of bridal train of historical objects, and I can feel both that here is this incredible resource of tradition, and also the weight of history and the weight of tradition, and that it can be a blessing and it can be a burden, and we need to be able to be honest about the kind of multiplicity of ways that those things relate to us. And so that's what the kind of work opens up for me, but it gets there indirectly, if that comes back to your point.
That is, I think that the media issues, the issues of what medium is working with what forms, subject matter in Dana's work is really a key to the sense of the way I understand direction. So I totally think that the way you just spoke about the loop, and also the space, the way two of you talked about the space and its theatricality in the center of a gallery without there any active performance going on, is also another sense of indirection that I feel in the installation.
Yeah, and when you presented the question early on, I thought, oh, great. I'm going to be like, I don't know. What's my answer going to be? And then I was like, as I was talking, I was like, I said wayfinding a lot of times without even thinking about it ahead of time. Yeah. So it is similar to what Richard was just saying. It is reading this work is really a sense about how things have this multiplicity, how there's an honoring and a gifting, but in exchange of that, there can be a responsibility, and that responsibility can be very heavy sometimes to carry those gifts, to carry those objects, to carry culture in spaces is both a kind of a responsibility which has weight, and also a beautiful thing as well. And so it's working on these levels that are indirect, that don't quite allow us to confront one or the other, but I think do give us tools. I mean, in this interview, Dana gave us 6 tools to use, and I think, like, when I think about Dana's practice as a person in the community, as an artist, as a, creating spaces, I think, like, she's given plenty of, really direct approaches in terms of social change, in terms of social relations, in terms of engaged kinds of practices. They don't always end up in a gallery space, and that's what's particularly beautiful about that work as well, is that, coming to know Dana is not just about coming to know this body of work in the gallery today. It's coming to know her influence on young Indigenous filmmakers, on young women, on other artists, in her teaching roles and her pedagogy, and how she constructs that and is able to, again, make that space. And I inferred, we both talked about the land and how you can read it into the space of the kind of theatrical space, which we're not have given many clues to, but that space is also the sky. And so it's this, again, this idea of reflection and inverting and indirection and wayfinding that are sort of constantly balancing out, perhaps, in this work. Because that open space is also the space of being in the prairies and looking up at the sky, which is all consuming and yet completely giving as well. And I remember doing the small interview with Dana, nervously asking her questions for her retrospective, which I felt completely kind of inequipped to do, and leaving. The sky was just doing beautiful things in Vancouver, and one of the last things she sort of said that was sort of echoing through my mind was, you can learn everything you need to know from the sky. And I sort of walked home with this Claxton mantra in my head, and it again was a generous kind of invitation into this point of inquiry, which wasn't necessarily devoid of conflict or the need to be weak or the need to be empowered, but it gave some tools to find a way through that.
You want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe pick up or kind of interpret indirectional based on what Richard and Tania have said as well, and maybe expand a bit on Tania's comments earlier on too about the slowness in the work and the space in between. Because I think it's not only temporal, it's the kind of space that's opened up in the flat field of the image itself. And I think it's that sense of being both puzzled and mesmerized that creates this kind of dynamism between the spectator and the work that I think is what's in some ways so generous and generative about the work. So it's if I reinterpret indirectional, it's that it's not going in a fixed line to a destination, but it allows you to kind of dwell in the space of trying to figure out what's going on. And I was interested when, I think, Richard, you said that your concern about the face being covered. It's funny, because I thought about it from the inside, and it's maybe because I saw Fringed when Dana was wearing a kind of form of concealed face, but I was thinking about it as a place of safety. Sure. From, the inside perspective. And I think in some ways that's what the work allows to happen, is that your own relationship to what you're looking at shifts and changes. In my office at home, the work that I have right in front of my desk now is from the Mustang suite, and it's a really complicated name that I never remember, so I wrote it down. Mama has a pony girl, ... named History and sets her free. And when I first got it, I sat in front of it and I went, what is going on in this image? And thinking about space also, there's the way that you've got Samaya, who's on one side, who's dressed in, I don't want to say traditional, but in a kind of a gown or a robe, and basically bestowing a hand out to a white woman that is dressed in this kind of burlesque horse outfit with high heels and a horse mouthpiece. And then there's quite a bit of space on the right-hand side to allow her to move out into. So the image is kind of slightly unbalanced. But, you know, that's a work that I can continue to look at, whether it's the details in the costume itself, or it's imagining Dana staging all of this, because often for those of us that know Dana, and she often gets these kind of like flashes of images and then actualizes, you know, it comes to her usually in these kind of flashes, and then she kind of builds around them. And one of the things that, I don't know whether you've shown it in Vancouver or not, but she actually has made a 6-hour video about the making of the Mustang suite, which we brought to Montreal and screened it. And it's a really confounding piece. So in thinking about slowness and duration, and I understand also that Dana has made a work which is about a short video that's about the making of these photographs as well. So in some ways you're taken into the backstage, into the kind of theatrical making of, and again it kind of destabilizes the fixed nature of a singular image by opening up the space of the making of it itself.
Thank you for those thoughts. I want to sort of open it up to everybody now. I'm just going to throw out some terms that have come up that have seemed to me to be important, but please feel free to bring anything else into the conversation or questions, whatever. I assume I'm supposed to call on everybody, is that right, Amy? And then somebody will move around? You've got the mic. Barbara has the mic. Okay, yeah, put up your hands and I'll call on you and the mic will arrive. Focalization, bodies that matter, beauty and its problems and its pitfalls, the location for art and art made for location. I want to say slow art now. I want to say like the slow art movement. I think that's kind of cool. And feminism and the place of the Indigenous body today. Those are just a few things that have come up in the talks and conversation, but see where we go with your thoughts.
Or we can just sit here awkwardly.
Yeah. I like how your question was also like a lot of weight and also a lot of space that I'm hoping people can discuss. But those, you know, such heavy ideas that really take us, and maybe we can take some cues from the work to find our way through some of that material.
I'm sure this audience is capable of that.
Oh yeah,
because I know most of them, and they really are. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's really terrific to have the time publicly to kind of speculate and think about all your very open ways of thinking about Dana's work. Just to pick up on something Richard said about the figure and the horizon line, the video work. I guess I'm not that, I guess for me when she stands up, it's not necessarily affirmative in the sense that, oh, I've stood up. Because I think it points to the kind of complexity in the work where I would say for me, it's like when she's crawling, when she's on her force, there's a kind of relationship to the earth and another kind of subversion going on in terms of thinking about our remove from sentient life or other forms of life. And it's not to challenge you per se, but it is the kind of irony and the duplicity and the kind of awareness when you're putting something out there, how it will be read. And then, like you say, you know, kind of double take, rethinking, oh, is it what it appears to be in terms of specific strategies that are in play, and especially with representational modes that are invested in power and capitalism and the kind of exploitive situation that we find ourselves in, which is, you know, a continuing legacy of the kind of extractive colonial kind of thinking. So I find that having kind of gotten on the ground myself for various reasons in my own work, I find that really, that's something that keeps me going. And that's not to say that when you stand up, yes, it's affirmative. And I see that kind of horizontality as also in the context of where we are in the downtown east side. I very much understand what you're speaking about, but I just want to affirm that there's many other layers going on for me when I look at this image. And especially from, like, I think the connection between all things that move and all things that also don't move, and the blurred lines. And not speaking necessarily in relation to Indigenous knowledge myself personally, but in thinking about the line between the human and non-human, I guess, and thinking about our current situation in terms of the Anthropocene as well.
It keeps on being in my head that I forgot to say when Dana thanked and thought about all the resources that went into the work. She also thanked the silkworms.
Yeah. That was wonderful, Janine. Thank you so much. I think that to consider those kind of complexities of communication between different individuals within our community is really wonderful. And at the time of this exhibit, Chris Dikiakis' work was still up at the Mendel Art Gallery, and of course the Bo Dick show is up at the Belkin. So that notion of artifactualization of a culture was really being explored by a lot of people. But I'm really interested in what Jinmi is saying, because of subject position, and you were talking about it too, Monika, that thing about how we're viewing the piece. Like sometimes we're on the inside and sometimes we're on the outside, and we change that position and it moves around, those multiple kinds of ways of seeing. So, and I wondered about that. Like I wondered like how you saw Dana, like, do you see from both positions as well? Do you see from the inside and from the outside of these pieces? Yeah. It's interesting when we make work. No, we're not sort of determining. And I think you used the word. How was the word? Redirect. Indirection. Indirection. That as artists, we function from a place of indirection, especially when we have these kind of layers of complexity in the work. And recently, one of the students that I'm working with, Dion Paul, who's been working with artifacts as well and creating artifacts, is looking at ceremonial activism. And whenever I've seen Dana's work, there has been this quality of ceremonial activism that the works have this ceremonial quality to them and quality of the sacred. Well, she's backing up, and she's got this mundane quality and this societal critique happening simultaneously. So I find that really interesting, and I don't know if anybody wants to comment on it.
I might say something about the indirection. What I had in mind was a strategy, and I'm sure it wasn't clear, but because I didn't have a long time to talk, and I'm probably not going to do Gerald Vizenor justice by just capsulizing it like the way I did and the way I will now. But I think by indirection, he really meant a strategy of indirection. And what it does then to you when you look at work or read work that has a strategy behind it of indirection. And I think it's difficult to find that place where you can achieve a strategy of indirection. I think that's what he's saying. For most of us, except for Indigenous peoples, is basically his point. They have a point of view or a location, a focalization. One of you used that term. A focalization that is it's not like other focalizations. So when I think of art like Dana's, I think, well, the focalization is going to be different. And that's just a given. And it's a good given because she uses it in her own, as a strategy, I think. And it's part of what gives the work the visual power that it has. So I think that's how I was thinking about Vizenor and indirection as a strategy, a strategic taking on of that role.
I guess I just want to push back a little about crawling. And not because I don't think your reading is legitimate, of course it is. And I guess one of the things that I tried to say was that, and it may be a forced relationship that I'm creating, but when we see someone stand there and then we see someone standing here praying, we're seeing some kind of transcendence in my mind, but it's not a Christian transcendence where you transcend the earth, because look at her, she's looking up and she's looking down. That's what I was kind of trying to point to. And when you're standing on the landscape, especially the plains landscape, your feet are on the earth, and you're already the intermediary to things above. That said, I have a very hard time seeing a Native woman crawling along the ground and not having one reading that's going to be present there be more than just kind of communing with the earth, but about seeing someone struggling. And again, maybe it's just because I'm in this neighborhood and I'm seeing literally people struggling along the ground. I just can't see that as a, I can't help but see getting on your feet after that as being empowering somehow.
Yeah, I certainly don't, I mean, I don't think we need to be binarized here.
No, I'm not trying to, yeah.
I'm not, I totally understand. I just want to say that, though, I think within the work, there's always the kind of citation of something that's dominant and then something else that undoes itself and complicates it. That's all I'm mentioning.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm just going to say something that comes to mind in terms of covering the face as well, because I think about our early work, which we haven't addressed particularly, not that we would address every work, but Buffalo Bone China, the performance. And we talked a little bit about the performative in the still image here, but I like to think about Buffalo Bone China as an early work because it's a really direct, physical, confrontational, conflict relationship with the material, and in it, Dana is, I think there's a, the see-through like plastic containments to keep everybody safe from shards, and then Dana's also wearing just a see-through, transparent safety mask as she continually smashes with different implements buffalo bone china made from, of course, we can think about the extermination or near extermination of the buffalo and all the weight of that as a strategy to starve people, to, you know, to facilitate colonial extraction and all that has come and is coming. And so I just think about those two very different ways to think about, and fringed as well, which I was not able to see, but the different ways that that's functioning through just work I see demonstrated in the practice. And I wanted to make sure to mention that piece, which I think still has a real resonance to it. And I like to think about it in some ways, the safety that is transparent versus the safety that is obscured.
Are there other questions or comments? Be along other lines or other thoughts that the work has provoked in you?
Hi. Thank you for your really thoughtful presentations. I was struck by a phrase that Monika used, inscribes Indigenous culture into everyday practice. And what it got me thinking about is that it's not just, that Dana's not just inscribing into everyday practice, but especially with the piece here and the light box, which I can't help but think of the Vancouver School and Rodney Graham's work and Stan Douglas's work, Jeff Wall's work. But it's inscribing itself into the canon. And I think that's really important. Dwayne Linklater's another artist who has been doing that with his own work, but also with the work of like Norval Morrisseau and Benjamin Chichi, bringing those out to people and making them aware when he gives talks. And I just think this is really, it's a really important thing that's being done.
Yeah. I just want to say, I think about with all of the items that Dana is showing, the extension of her thinking and thinking about every single material is, of course, she's also thinking about every other single artist she's bringing into the exhibition, in that there's a number of artists, makers of some of the work that we're seeing. And I agree. When I was talking about a kind of how I know nothing about surrealist film, but was going to say stuff about surrealist film, I also know nothing about sort of photoconceptualism, but I read that also very clearly in the work, which is, you know, this work has an aesthetic which can become a kind of sanitized, clean aesthetic, and yet it's completely the opposite. It is such a filled, rich, multiplicitous space.
Yeah, I would, if you're done.
Yeah, I'm done.
I think, in a way, when we deal with the canon, you know, it is a double-edged sword, as I was saying about art as well, because I think we really want to be smart about how we deal with the canon, because the problem is that there's a canon. It's not that there aren't work that is important and that we don't want to pay attention to, and it's not that we don't have to make selections, but I think we always want to do it in a way that's unreconciled to the kind of power that's at work when we make canons. And I think that's, in a way, maybe you helped me clarify what I was trying to get at in the tension in this work between objects that have a kind of tradition of circulation and the way in which the contemporary idea of art is precisely about taking objects out of circulation and putting them in a kind of rarefied space of contemplation. And now, Dana didn't respond by saying, okay, I'm going to go and make these kind of objects and circulate them in my community. She may do that, I have no idea. But she decided to also intervene in the art space. Yeah. And I think, in a way, just as much as this work uses the kind of vocabulary and the intelligence and all those kinds of things, the formal and conceptual tools that we identify as being, you know, potentially canonical work, it's also a subversion of the canon. Just by the very materiality of these objects and what they are and how they circulate, it already tells us something about what the problem of the canon is. You know, because here's actually this is the dream that people have had since modernism. Here's art and life together in traditional indigenous cultures all over the place. And now, you know, we can't just bring that back in a simple way, but it certainly, to me, it puts it in the canon, and it also raises really important questions about how canons get formed and who participates in that and how art circulates. Okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, just to say that I don't think it's either or. I think that there's this multiple layering going on, and it speaks to Dana's sense of the multiple gazes that are cast upon the Indigenous body and the Indigenous woman's body. And so when a piece like Rattle is at the Metropolitan Museum, it is inscribing itself in a dominant anthropological and ethnological discourse. When it's in a space like this, it is in a fine arts discourse that is in Vancouver particularly, but as Janine was also saying, and Richard as well, that it's on West Hastings of Vancouver, that is, you know, a 2-block area, 3-block area that has come into dominant focus more recently, as well in popular culture. And so I think it can do these things. I mean, what the remarkable thing to me is about the work is that it's able to kind of function at these multiple levels and with the kind of complexity of these layerings, which, you know, to come back to Dana's sense of the complexity of rehumanization is that process has to be happening in multiple ways. For multiple audiences, and I think you know, one thinking about Dana's work from over the 25 years, I think one thing that has really struck me is the kind of irreverence of the work as well. It's you know, looking at a piece like Headdress, which is there, you know, when I first looked at the work, I thought, oh, this is some precious object that has been taken from, you know, that she's borrowed from somewhere. And then, you know, you read later on, oh, in fact, it's just she's gone through her own materials and pulled together. Oh, no, that's just my stuff. And then I decided to kind of construct this beautiful headdress. So there's a type of irreverence that I think you know, defies kind of reifying this work into one specific discourse or another. I mean, the other thing that she said about it as well is that it wasn't partially in response to, it was partially in response to, there was a European fashion company that had come out with a fashion line that was called, I think it was D squared, sorry, my fashion vocabulary is not very complex either, but that had come out with a line of clothing that was called D Squad, I think. And there was a huge backlash on social media where they finally withdrew the clothing. So, in other words, it's inscribing itself there in, you know, fashion discourse, essentially, of popular culture.
I think also another part of the canon and I think it's really great that you raised that topic, is how to negotiate the inscription of the discussion of Dana's work, and it's trying to understand it using theories of post-colonial discourse or art theory or anything that's already been instantiated through institutions of art and education and criticality like journals. How do we keep her work fresh and yet without subsuming it into this discourse and making it almost covered up by a kind of canonical banality in terms of how we speak about it? And that's something I'm really have been aware of, and speaking to her is trying to find the right language as an art historian. How do I find the right language that does justice to this work? For me, the right language is a theoretical language, but which theoretical language? And if I use something, is it going to do some harm to it? Is it going to cover it up and bury it underneath this whole pile of art theory where it doesn't really belong? So that's something I feel very conscious about negotiating. And one reason I took Visinor on was because he too has been conscious of that his whole life and working with that problem, both as a teacher and as a writer and as a poet. Amy. Oh, Benjamin.
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for the panel. Thanks, Dana, for the wonderful work. There's something since the opening that I've been thinking about with this work, and I didn't really know how to formulate it, but I think that the notion of the photographic would be really the question I have with this work. But the photographic as a very particular type, as being a light, being inscribed on object, being materialized. I think that the notion of light in that exhibition is very important, both as projection, light box, light coming through us, and us being able to see through veil. The notion of object is very important, object as presence, as photographic objects, but also the very object of the photograph being either light box or textile. And I think that the notion of the light and the object always shift between each of the objects and create that kind of movement. I'm thinking recently about the talk of Kasia Silverman coming in Vancouver, talking about maybe a different way of looking at the history of photography and seeing that history of light coming through us through different apparatus and different ways of seeing light and understanding light. And I'm thinking back about that, what you brought Dana's mantra, that everything we can know at looking at the sky, and that the light is also coming from the sky, sun, the stars. So I was wondering if you had maybe that's my question, what's the place of the photographic in this particular exhibition as it comes to embodied light?
Thank you. Somebody want to address that issue of light or the photographic?
No, nothing's coming to mind right
No?
now. So
Well,
I haven't already said.
Monica.
I mean, you know, I teach media studies.
You teach
So
media
I
studies.
teach media studies. So like the big thing now is about network screens. So, you know, to me, these works exist here in this gallery space, but they're also circulating on all these art blogs and on the CBC website. And so they're, you know, because media culture is so complex now, I think that we certainly, I mean, I should have brushed up on my Kaja Silverman as well, I guess. But we certainly can discuss it, we could certainly discuss it in that way, but I would also draw attention to the kind of proliferation of the way that images circulate, not only, you know, as light boxes here, but that they just, you know, are surrounding us now as we're, you know, sitting with our phones, and we've got algorithms that are sending us signals of which news sites we should be going to, or I'm getting social media messages that you know, Dana's show happened here and that there's going to be a talk. So I think there's totally multiple ways that the images themselves can be discussed, but also the way that they circulate.
Yeah, and I would, oh, should I be?
Oh, I just wanted to add to that because I think Richard addressed your question in a sense earlier when you spoke about the landscape quality as we came into space. And I remembered that when I walked in the space and she was crawling at the time and I sat down, but I looked around, oh sorry, I actually prefer my own voice. I looked around and you saw the light here, and it was dark in here, and someone spoke about the dramatic quality of the room, but there was a sense of spaciousness within that. Do you remember that first sense when you came in? There was a sense of spaciousness, and then there was the light here and the light there, and the light did seem very important in terms of landscape, but an interesting space, eh? More like almost going inside, you know, at night or something. You know, the quality of urban landscape, but that difference between having that piece, which was so much about the struggle and so immediate to where we are, and that delicate issue of that little bit of light hitting her, the artifact she had around her neck, the tiniest little bit of light. So I think you're right that the light is very important as we move around the room. That was a good observation.
And I think I was going to just mention something quickly about the space of the studio, because of course everything is, Dana's working in the studio, and that she's also creating these windows into the studio space in terms of the durational making of some of the work. And I know Dana talks about really loving that space of the studio, and interestingly, I think it's a space of light, because when the studio is just, you know, nothing is lit or nothing is focused, then it's this sort of empty space. And so it is light, I think, that I read into thinking about the work. You know, I just point out something like the birch bark basketry in the sort of distance of this image, and thinking about light, that is that as much of a photograph as the end product in terms of the interplay of light and systems and our Earth itself, and you know, that this is what grew the tree, which become the basket, which then is informing and becoming the photograph. So yeah, I like to think about extending time. So we're not talking about time just as, you know, the invention of photographic practice maybe, but light as and time as sort of larger or more immersive than that.
Well, I think there's also the decision to paint the gallery what Amy described as forest black, which is interesting to think about too. No, I know. It's forest. No, that's the name of the paints, right? The paint color? Yeah.
It's a good color.
Yeah, it's not like black pepper. Or anyway, but that it's the decision to go black as opposed to white also, I I think brings a cinematic quality to the work, or the black box of the cinematic theater, as opposed to the gallery space.
And we can think about how that reads differently than the Mustang suite, which is a brilliant white space of the studio, where we have this darkened space.
And I also think about the light issue, and I think in a certain sense what Silverman wants to say is she tries to literalize the sense of light in photography, and that sort of happens here because of the dark space that these works of art illuminate, or this is the picture that's happening now in this dark space of the apparatus of the gallery. So I think in that sense, light operates, symbolically, functionally, performatively here, and I think that's really interesting. So thanks for the question.
Yeah. I wanted to just say two quick things. One is about the name of this color. I've always been kind of encouraged by the failure of paint companies to be able to bring color into language, right? Because all they can do is give them specific names. It can be that or this, but we have no consensus about what this color is actually. So there's millions. My computer tells me, I can't remember how many millions of colors my computer tells me it can show, and almost none of them have names. There's something kind of beautiful about that. But that's just a digression. The other thing that I just wanted to note about light and theatricality is when I saw the opening, and you come into this space when, was it just dark out?
Yes.
It was just at night, but it becomes a lot harder to tell you're in a dark gray room once that exterior light goes down. You just feel like you're in a dark room. And actually it's quite a, I was kind of surprised. I meant to come here and revisit the show before I did the talk, and then I ended up getting sick. So I only came back into this space for the first time just when we came in. And I was surprised at how gray the grayness of the room. I barely noticed that at the opening, just because it just seemed like white walls that were dark. I don't know if anyone else had a similar experience or...
I think I'm made aware of the variations of gray that exist. I think that's a good point. Seeing the room at night and seeing it now.
Yeah, it's
and also
different.
the black background of the photographs and the video. I mean, there's variations of grays and blacks. Yeah. Okay, I think, is there one more question and then we have
Can I ask a question to the crowd?
Yeah,
Okay.
do you want to?
Hi, sort of following up on Benjamin's question about light. I was just wondering if the panelists could talk a bit more about what Tania brought up about Dana referring to some of the works as air boxes and fire boxes, and what those forces do in the work.
Question about air boxes and fire boxes and the
I don't
forces.
know. Yeah, I don't know much more about it other than just that kind of like irreverence is an interesting thing to talk about because like Dana, like in these works, there's a sort of a quick delivery and then a very, very slow happening. And so I don't know too much more about exactly what she was discussing there, but it certainly sat with me, and I think about, you know, all that we've said here today, and then think about how something that is this, you know, gallery object functioning, you know, this exquisite, masterful photograph, and then how it's also relating to the elemental. And, you know, you don't want to give a generalized kind of reading of that, but yeah, I don't know if I'm speaking to that very well at all, but, you know, I think she talks about this one as a wind box as well. You know, and that's Dana's kind of language where there can be, it's not really, it's irreverence with an incredible braveness, I guess is what I want to say. It's like irreverence with such balanced courage that, you know, that she can kind of name this and we can then see it in this completely different way and think about them as functioning more than just, you know, a light box in the kind of context of art history and lighting and illuminating an image, that it all of a sudden allows us to then find our ways into thinking through every sort of small part of the image or the idea or the form itself.
Before I thank you, the audience, and thank the speakers, I think Dana wants to say something. So may I introduce you, Dana, which I really can't do since you're here in the gallery, but would you mind saying something? She's coming somehow. Oh.
I just wanted to thank everybody for coming here today, and to thank you all for your generous time in thinking about my work. And I was swept away listening, so I'm very grateful to hear your thoughts. And so, so I wanted to, on behalf of Amy and myself, is to give you all a gift. And Amy has so beautifully wrapped them. And it's from the Paris series, and it's of an image of the Grand Palais, and it's an exhibition space. So I was thinking about, why we're here.
Thank you.
And we're here for art, but we're also here because of space. And this exhibition space that we inhabit, right? The home of where we find ourselves, and it's the home of art, and it's the home of what brings me here and you here, and it's our shared space. And so it's an interior shot of of an exhibition that was going on, and it's just all walls. And so I just want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, especially the speakers who spent so much time thinking about today, and all of you for staying and listening. And please take some time to talk to each other or to us. We have some time now in the gallery if you'd like to.